Welcome back to the Wise Athletes Podcast. This is episode number 50. Today I have something amazing to share with you. I have spent the last year hunting for and failing to find a silver bullet that makes all the difference in health and fitness for the older athlete. But now I have it. You've heard about and perhaps even read the books by journalists who are reporting on the science and the hopeful speculation about breathing differently to gain better health and athletic performance. I decided I would talk to one of the central figures in this pursuit of better breathing, George Dallam, professor of exercise science at CSU at Pueblo, who is a former national teams coach for USA Triathlon, a past professional triathlete, and a lifelong endurance athlete with a personal and professional journey of exploration and discovery of proof for the advantages of nasal breathing. Nasal breathing is not some trick or a hack to gain an unnatural advantage. It is the designed-in way to breathe properly. That nose isn't sticking out of your face to hold up your sunglasses. Failing to regularly nasal breathe during exercise, during sleep, and in life in general causes many problems which the older athlete encounters all too frequently. Dr. Dallam says one simple rule: breathe through the nose all the time, or as much as possible. The more the better. Today we will hear about George's rediscovery of nasal breathing, his personal experience in adapting to nasal breathing for 100% of his training, racing, sleeping, and in life, and his published research that showed that athletes could adapt to nasal breathing to gain important health advantages without sacrificing VO2 max or time to exhaustion. George says it takes between 6 weeks and 6 months to fully adapt, but even along the way you will start to receive benefits, just a few of which include: Number 1, better filtering of particles and viruses. So, you want to have fewer sinus infections? Stop having bronchitis? 2, less damage to the lungs from breathing unfiltered and untreated air. Want to avoid or recover from exercise-induced bronchial restriction? Want to stop wheezing? Number 3, less energy spent on breathing by extracting more oxygen per breath. So, you want to have more oxygen for your leg muscles to use? Number 4, improve stress management and sleep. Nasal breathing is relaxing while mouth breathing is stressful. And 5, a stronger diaphragm for stronger breathing as well as better posture and core stability. Yeah, this is a particularly long episode. It's about 1.5 hours. I thought about cutting it down, but I didn't dare. I recommend you listen to the entire thing. Take as long as you need, but listen, take notes, print the show notes, and relearn the ability to breathe through your nose 100% of the time. If you are able to capture the same benefits as Dr. Dallam, you will hit PRs, be more relaxed, more thoughtful, sleep better, and be happier as a direct result. That sounds pretty good to me. All right, let's talk to Dr. Dallam. George Dallam, welcome to the Wise Athletes Podcast.
Joe, nice to see you.
It's good to have you on, and appreciate you taking some time to help us out. As we've talked about, George, the focus of the Wise Athletes Podcast is the older athlete and how we can improve athletic performance today and retain our athletic capability for a long time into the future. Clearly, we're talking about this intersection of fitness and health, about how being smart about our behaviors in these areas can compound to enhance the effectiveness of each. And with your background, George, there is no doubt you're going to be able to help us out here. You are a longtime masters athlete.
That's true.
What did you say, 58 years?
I started year-round swimming at 6, swam through collegiate, started triathlon bike racing 1980, triathlon 1981. Been doing triathlon consistently since then. I actually started playing water polo again here. I was a collegiate water polo player too.
Nice.
Started playing water polo again with a couple of other guys my age recently.
Nice. Well, so longtime masters athlete, former triathlon national team coach, and currently professor of exercise science at Colorado State University at Pueblo.
That's correct.
All of that, right?
That's right.
Excellent. So you're a man with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. And the one thing that I'm the most interested in, I think personally, but also this thread, this really interesting thread that sort of runs through all of your experience, is nasal breathing for athletes.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, that is just wonderful, because that is going to be the subject of our discussion today. I wonder, though, before we dive into that, you've shared a little bit about your background, but I wonder if you could just tell us the summary of, you as an athlete. Do you still compete? How did you get into coaching, at that elite level? And then the nasal breathing thing, where did that all come from?
Well, as an athlete, I do still compete. I'm long past the idea of trying to do Ironman events, et cetera. I do local triathlons up in the Boulder and sometimes down here in Colorado Springs area. 3 or 4 a year. My wife has been also doing triathlon for some 30 years. So it's one of those things
Right.
we kind of like to do together.
It's a family affair.
Yeah. And then the water polo is basically just because I love to play water polo. I've always loved to play water polo.
You're a water guy.
Yeah. The elite coaching, right? I was raised by a mom who was a very successful swimming coach in aquatics director in Pennsylvania. And my dad, who was a successful wrestling coach in State College, Pennsylvania.
Oh, my.
So, that whole mentality, like I started coaching probably when I was about 15. It was always there. My mom also was very enamored of Doc Councilman. She shoved his book, Science of Swimming, in my hand when I was 15, and I immediately read it. And, I became sort of the science view in our whole sort of collaborative thing, writing her workouts for her high school team even before I went there. So I've always been interested in that whole nexus between training, coaching, performing myself, et cetera, and how physiology and biomechanics kind of support that. So it was a kind of a natural flow for me to go to that area academically. I went to the University of Arizona when I was still trying to finish my collegiate career in water polo. They dropped their program, so I really focused more academically while I was there. Did my master's there in a program that was really noteworthy at that time. Some of the great physiologists in exercise were there at the time. Jack Wilmer would be who a lot of your readers would know about, Vic Convertino, a whole host of people, Roger Anoka, Mike Joyner, right, if you really know physiology. He was a student, actually, a PhD student when I was there. And so, that gave me this grounding in the science. Years later, I came back to UNM and did my PhD with a guy named Rob Robergs, who's also another great physiologist, still is a great physiologist. And all through that time, I was involved in athletics myself and coaching. So at some point when I was doing my PhD and we had started this project having to do with altitude, USA Triathlon opened up a position for national teams coach. And I had kind of said to myself from the time I was much younger that if that happened, I would apply, right? That if they ever created a national team, if they got Olympic acceptance, I thought I was a good fit for that. And I had been a pretty successful triathlete in the early going before there really was pro racing as we know it now. Just basically you won races and you got paid money. So you were successful.
Okay.
And so I applied, happened to be Jimmy Riccatello, who was a good friend of mine, and I kind of had helped him get going in triathlon. He was on the board, so he convinced Karen Smyers that George was probably the right guy to hire, and before you know it, I got hired.
Awesome.
Started that, worked there for 2 years. I'll be quite frank, I didn't get along with the executive director from day one, so we parted ways at some point. And I continued to coach athletes who I had started working with in that program. Elites, Hunter Kemper would be the one most people know about because he's the best U.S. Olympic distance triathlete by far in history.
Okay.
4 and eventually 5 Olympic Games. 4 Olympic Games. That's how I sort of segued into elite coaching. Prior to that, I had always coached in water polo and swimming and running, et cetera. It's just was always in me, even in cycling to some degree. And so that's kind of where all this came together. So why the nasal breathing thing in this sort of a background? Well, from the time I was little, I had all that upper respiratory stuff that swimmers get, right? Sinus infections, pneumonia by the time I was 12. And in those days, in the 70s, when a 12-year-old got pneumonia, they thought it was a big deal, right? They said, you go home. You can't come to school. So I had to spend 4 weeks, basically at home on my own.
Wow.
They didn't really understand about walking pneumonia yet. So, I continued to have those kinds of problems throughout my athletic career, all the way up to about 15 years ago. Even, as a college professor, still doing triathlon, I had frequent sinus infections, bronchitis, pneumonia, et cetera. So that's not super uncommon among endurance athletes, right?
Sure.
And, I tried the conventional wisdom in Texas in the 80s. I remember one doc said to me that you have asthma. Put me on theophylline, which is a maintenance drug of that era. They don't use it anymore. The reason I use it is because it creates a lot of anxiety and sympathetic activation. Within 2 days, I just stopped taking it because I didn't like feeling that way. Yeah. And I didn't really have asthma, right? I had what we now call exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. But at that time, that idea was just formulating, right?
Okay.
So long and short of it, maybe 15 years ago, I'm home on a weekend. I'm not going out because I've got a bad sinus infection and I'm just sort of unhappy. I love to ride my bike. I love to go out and run, swim, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I got on the internet, got out of the box, as we say, and started investigating the wacko ideas.
Yeah.
And one of the wacko ideas is that, and I could tell you about this post, it's still there, a guy back in New Jersey who coaches high school kids in cross country, and he's like an engineer. He wrote this long post about how his kids all ran barefoot and breathed through their nose. John Rauchi, I think his name is, and it's a very well-written, intelligent post. So that, that meant something to me, right? He was very logical about how he explained why he thought it was useful. So I thought, well, hell, I have nothing to lose. I'm just going to try this. At the same time, Oprah had made neti pots or sinus rinsing also very popular. And so I had really not known about that, but I read about it that day and I thought I'm going to try this too. And I just started doing that, using a neti pot every day. And I tried to do whatever I could breathing nasally, which wasn't much at first, right? At first, it was just the beginnings of my warm up. Within a year, I was fully adapted to that. I ran some PRs. I ran a mile PR in a corporate cup event over the last 10 years.
So you were faster nasal breathing than you had been mouth breathing.
That's exactly right. Not a lot faster. I think I had been probably around 5:48. And at this point, I'm like 48 years old. I'm not a great runner. And I ran a 5:32. I hadn't run a 5:32 since I was really young, right? Since I was in college. And then I'm a better cyclist on a 20K sort of hilly route where I've been riding at about 31, 32 minutes. I rode 29 minutes, breathing nasally the whole time. So at the time, I thought, okay, this certainly is making me feel better, but it also seems to be helping me. Now, at the time, I couldn't say it was because of the nasal breathing. It might have been because I wasn't getting sick anymore. That was the other outcome.
Yeah, you were training better.
From the time that I started to do this, I just stopped getting sick. And I went fully 5 years without anything, right? Without any kind of cold, upper respiratory infection of any kind. And, every once in a while I have some sort of minor thing, but I'm very infrequent now to get sick as a result of doing this, which was the first thing that helped me to be more consistent in training. That was part of why I might have performed better. But now, downstream, as we've studied this more, as I've become really interested in it academically, we understand that there's probably a mechanism there that might have been helping as well. So.
Fantastic. Let's get into this nasal breathing. Before we get into too much of the weeds, I wonder if you could make your case, the 100,000 foot. And I'll just start by saying that if everybody's breathing 20,000 breaths a day, every day of their lives, without interruption for more than a minute or so, or that was the end, then how hard could it be to believe that breathing better or worse would have a pretty big effect on our physiology? So it's not a shock to me that what you're saying is true for you, but make your case using your personal experience and the research that you've done and whatever else that you can share with us, that at this high level, why is nasal breathing good?
Let me just sort of summarize, because that conversation could go for 2 hours before you got to speak again, which is easy for me, right? So, basically, if you have any understanding of anatomy at all, there's an old axiom that's commonly, stated, which is that, your mouth is for eating, your nose is for breathing, right? If you understand your anatomy, if you've had even the most rudimentary course in anatomy, you understand that all of the conditioning of our air, all the apparatus for that anatomically, it's in the nasal passage. Our mouth doesn't have that kind of apparatus, right? Our mouth is designed for being able to masticate, chew food, salivary amylase, so we can start to digest even while glucose is in the mouth. It's designed for intaking food, right? We can breathe through our mouth, but we're not designed for breathing through our mouth. So if you think about it that way, I have a simple rule, which is that you should breathe through your nose whenever possible. Now, as a kind of a pool guy, right, as a guy who operated, along with coaching and swimming, I had occasions to manage pools too. The key thing is keep the water filtering, right? We have this filtration system. You turn those filters off for some reason, within like a day, your water has gone completely south and you have to replace it, right?
Yeah.
So, the nose is how we filter what moves in and out of our body. Just like the water that moves around and circulates in the pool goes through filters, the air that we breathe in and out can go through filters if we use our nose. And in doing that, we preserve the function of our body, right? And when we don't do that, we start to immediately damage our body, right? We have immediate damage from breathing through our mouths. And so when we start to think about it that way, and then, my simple rule is you should breathe through your nose whenever you can, right? Whether that's while we're sitting here talking, which makes it tough because you're talking, so you tend to breathe through your mouth. Or whether we're exercising or whether we're under stress at all times. So you should
Sleeping.
Right. You should sleeping. Absolutely. Sleeping hugely important. You should always try to breathe through your nose. And that includes exercise, right? There's nothing that changes about this whole concept of filtering the air when we exercise, right? We still need to do that. In fact, you could make a good argument that we need to do it more because we're breathing so much.
Yeah, so much more air.
That's right.
You need to filter it even more, right? So the answer, I guess, if I'm drawing a bow around what you've said, is that nasal breathing is not a hack designed to trick the body into performing better. Nasal breathing is how you're supposed to breathe.
I would absolutely agree.
So we're not talking about the benefits of nasal breathing. We ought to be talking about the detriments of not breathing the way we're designed to breathe.
That idea of normal, right? We tend to think, well, oral breathing or breathing through my mouth when we exercise is normal. So that word normal means what occurs the most. And that's absolutely true, right? Most people breathe through their mouths when they exercise, but normal is not the same thing as natural or good.
Yeah.
Right? What's good, what's natural is for us to use our breathing filtering apparatus. So breathing through our nose. And, if we go back before the modern ideas, exercise, sport, the way we try to be physically active now, because very few of us have jobs anymore where we have to actually, expend a lot of energy to make our living or survive. If we go back before the ideas of sport, et cetera, there's evidence of people who had to engage in, pretty high level physical activity, but were probably doing that nasally. One of my favorite bits of evidence is because in the 80s, also spent some time working on the Tohono Reservation, or what some people might know as the Papago Nation, which is west of Tucson. I was doing health promotion with the tribe. I actually worked for the tribe, not for the Indian Health Service. And they were trying to take over their healthcare system. And one of the things we started figuring out is all the stuff we had learned about health promotion that applied to the Anglo population of the broader U.S., didn't make as much sense to Otham, right? And so we started realizing we need to address running because running is what Otham love, right? What's part of their culture, et cetera. And so I got this book called Native American Running at the time. Someone gave it to me actually down there when I started realizing I need to focus more on that. And, one of the things I remember from that book is, and it's stuck in my mind long before I ever started breathing nasally, was a description of how Apache trained their young by having them put water in their mouth. And then they would say, go run to that mesa and back, but you have to spit the water back out to show me that they so powerfully understood the value of breathing through their noses. For them, that might have had an awful lot to do with hydration because they were living in desert conditions, southern Arizona, and or other places where Apache have historically lived. And that helps preserve water. But, just in general, right, this concept of people historically not necessarily opening their mouths to breathe, even under the sort of situation of exercise, might suggest that we've made this like a thing that we do as modern humans, right? It's normal because it occurs a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's what we should be doing or what's good.
Right. Okay. So that's the high level picture. I think that there's for the people that are listening, they're probably listening to this because they've heard something about the nasal breathing and they're curious to know more. But I think that we ought to slay some myths here, slay some dragons about breathing, and that maybe will set the stage for then a deeper dive into what's really going on here. So here are some things and feel free to jump in with your own myths, but I'll start the first one, and it's that when I feel a need to breathe, it's because I need more oxygen.
Yes. A lot of people understand breathing that way. They associate the idea with breathing more with getting more oxygen. You can go back to Guyton's original textbook of work physiology from the 50s. Even by then, we understood two substances in the blood tend to drive our need to breathe, CO2 and O2. But even in the 50s, we understood that CO2 was more powerful. It actually makes sense, too, because if we stop breathing, CO2 immediately starts to rise. So we immediately start to sense the urgency. If you stop breathing, O2 in your body won't have dropped precipitously for minutes, right? And so it makes more sense that our responsiveness to breathing comes from CO2. We've long understood this. We've demonstrated it, many, many times in the scientific literature. So what happens when we feel like we're not getting enough air isn't necessarily, it might be because there's some lack of oxygen, but it might not be. It might simply be that some condition is causing CO2 levels in the arterial blood to be higher than normal. And we sense that through what's called air hunger in the sciences, right? The sensation of not that I'm working hard, but that I'm not getting enough air for what I'm doing. That can happen too, even at rest. Like if you've ever tried, yogic breathing and tried to slow your breathing way, way down, probably you feel some air hunger because you're simply not breathing quickly. Or, I do this in my class all the time where the students basically do a little test where they just stop breathing and we wait to see their first sensation of air hunger. The average time is like 8 or 10 seconds, right? Within 8 or 10 seconds on average, and they're young, healthy college students in exercise science, they feel some urgency to breathe. So, once we get that, what stops people when they want to try this is they'll go out and say, okay, I heard this talking head with a white beard talk about, how you should breathe on my nose. So I'm going to go out and try this. Even like really well-educated people will do this, right? I had a reviewer on a paper do this. I'm just going to go out and see if I can do it. So they go out, they try to run as fast as they normally run. They feel this like extreme suffocation, air hunger, and they go, that's crazy. Can't do that. Well, what they're feeling for the most part is this high level of CO2. We have to get into some discussion about why that occurs in nasal breathing, but that doesn't mean you're not oxygenating yourself necessarily as much. There are conditions where you're not, but then with adaptation, that kind of goes away. Both the sensation of not getting enough air and the ability to oxygenate yourself goes away.
And we're going to get more into that because that is central to this whole idea of being able to adapt to nasal breathing. Okay, the next myth, I think, is that CO2 is bad, and I want to get rid of it.
So we tend to think of CO2 as bad, and even in physiology textbooks at some level, people will sort of describe it that way because we have to remove it. But the reality is that all substances in the body, even oxygen, have to be at homeostasis, right? There's some range where they're effective in the body, where they can carry out the roles, and then there are ranges where they're not effective, where they can even be damaging. For instance, oxygen, which we consider the life-saving, molecule, right? If you inspire 100% oxygen, you start to create rapid rates of perioxidation on your cells and destabilize them. It's toxic, right? Which is why we never inspire 100% oxygen. Divers never, for instance, take in 100% oxygen. And so CO2, because it's something produced in metabolism, it's actually, along with water, the end product of the basic breakdown of all the molecules that we consume for energy, glucose, carbohydrate, fat, protein, is something that continually wants to get out of homeostasis, so we have to keep removing it. But we maintain this amount of CO2 that's really critical, right? It's critical to all kinds of functions in the body. You could argue it's one of the most critical molecules in the body to normal functioning and has a really profound influence on our functioning when it gets out of those normal ranges. So because we remove it is because it's produced by metabolism, not because it's somehow bad. Every molecule potentially is bad, right? CO2 is no worse or no better than oxygen. It's just produced internally, whereas oxygen is something we consume and continually then, utilize.
And I think we'll hit more on here in a little bit about what bad things can happen when you don't have enough CO2 in your body. Okay, so the next myth is that breathing faster brings in more oxygen.
Yeah, so breathing is a thing like most things in the world. A good analogy would be riding a bike. I know you like to race, and I know probably some of your readers race, where there's an optimal sort of rate at which we do that, right? A gear is the analogy I like to use on a bike. If I throw you in 120-inch gear where you're pedaling about 40 RPMs, you're probably going to ride a time trial slower. And if I put you into like a 70-inch gear where you're pedaling and you over pedal like you can't control the pedals, you're also going to ride slower. You need that optimal range, probably 80 to 100 RPMs, right? So breathing's the same, right? There's this optimal range where we optimize the end game of breathing, which is to try to bring oxygen in and take CO2 out. We can breathe too much, right? And we can also breathe too little. Well, the idea is to find that middle ground. So here's a really easy to sort of understand common wisdom. Does it make sense that the rate at which we would breathe through our mouth, which is not really designed for breathing, would be better than the rate at which we breathe through the nose, which is designed for breathing, right? It kind of makes sense that the way that we breathe through the nose should be what we shoot for, not the way that we breathe through the mouth. Mouth does allow us to, when we breathe orally, to greatly increase ventilation. But what we know is, in effect, what we're doing is hyperventilating. We're breathing more than is actually necessary, and that doesn't necessarily improve our oxygenation. That's where the physiology gets complicated, right? Because oxygenation is not just about how much oxygen you bring to the lung. It has to do with how effectively that oxygen diffuses into the blood, how effectively the blood can carry it around the body, which has something to do with how the blood vessels dilate, how effectively it gets into the cell. The end game is how much oxygen we get to the cell, right?
Right, to make energy.
Right. So one of the simplest things about nasal breathing is it moves us to the right gear because we're using the apparatus designed for breathing, right?
Right. And breathing faster doesn't hyper-oxygenate you. It just blows off more CO2.
This one's easy to understand, again, with a little basic anatomy, right? You have these red blood cells floating by your lung, right? And they, of course, have hemoglobin. We all know about that protein because it's the basic molecule we always teach in a core biology class or anatomy and physiology. And it binds oxygen molecules, right? So here's the thing. No matter how much oxygen you have, in your lung, you only have so many red blood cells coming by. And as we know, those who've ever measured what's called the arterial oxygen saturation, a little device you put on your finger, at sea level, that's typically like 98 or 99%, which means most of your hemoglobin already has oxygen on it, right? So it's not like we can dump more oxygen in there. I've actually, we've been really interested in this in another way. I was involved in research years ago looking at hyperoxic training, where we would, give very high concentrations of oxygen. And while we were able to increase work a little bit, maybe 7 or 8%, it wasn't like unlimited, right? Even if you give people very high concentrations of oxygen, the body can only take so much. So breathing more air than you need to doesn't necessarily result in you oxygenating any better.
Great. Okay, next myth is that the act of breathing doesn't cost me much energy.
So that's really interesting, right? A big area that's exploded in the last 10 years is around the idea of just how much energy we actually use just to breathe. So if you think about that, most of us know about the diaphragm. And when we're at rest, we primarily contract the diaphragm. That opens up the lung a little bit, pressure drops, air comes in, then we let it relax. But once we start exercising, we start to use more and more muscles, the intercostals, all the chest muscles, the abdomen. And when people are doing something like running in a 5K, right, where they're ventilating or breathing very heavily, probably as much as 15% of the total energy they're expending is being expended by those breathing muscles, which are, again, just skeletal muscles like our other skeletal muscles, right? So they require oxygen and energy as well.
Yeah, they're using up some of that oxygen that they're bringing in.
That's exactly right. To not consider their oxygen cost, right? Which is no longer the case. In science, we get this. In fact, now a very popular approach to try to improve the ability of athletes who are already well trained otherwise is to train their breathing muscles specifically. To not consider how much oxygen they use and how much energy they require, you're missing the boat, right? They require a big percentage of what we use.
Yeah. And so a 10% improvement is going to show up in the equation. You're going to notice it.
Absolutely.
All right. So the next myth is that you can't get enough air to perform well when nasal breathing. So
that myth is easy to understand because, again, that experience I talked about earlier, you say, okay, I listen to this guy. I'm going to go out and, I normally run an 8-minute pace. I'm going to go out and just run normally and try to breathe through my nose. And, within 1 minute, you're feeling like you're suffocating, like you can't get air. Well, again, that's primarily about the sensation of CO2 driving your sense of air hunger. Now, if you never nasal breathe, right? If you're a person who always breathes through the mouth, not only when you exercise, but a lot of the other time as well, there is some development of the musculature, and that gets into a complicated idea. How do we actually recruit our diaphragm? It's mostly about resistance, right? So if you've not done that, there's some level at which you also are just not getting enough activation of the right muscles because when you breathe nasally, how you activate and breathe or how you activate your respiratory muscles starts to change a little bit. Mm-hmm. But mostly what you're experiencing is this air hunger idea, which means it isn't necessarily that you're not getting enough oxygen. It's that your levels of CO2 in the blood are rising. And, that's a complicated idea, but I could certainly talk about it, how that actually happens. And that leads you to believe that you're not getting enough air. Now, here's the thing. I have to reinforce this over and over again. Most of us would assume that that is always going to be that way. But it's like anything else in the body, right? Once our body starts to experience a different level of any particular molecule, particularly molecules that hit receptors, we change our regulation. We call that up or down regulating, right? We change how we respond to that. So, at first you might feel air hunger, but if you persist, that just goes away. You don't have to learn to deal with it or tolerate it in any way. It just goes away, right? You just have to keep exposing yourself to it. This is how people who do breath hold diving, this is a primary tool that they use, right? The rest of us would go underwater, and in about 30 seconds, we'd be going like, I got to go to the surface. Like, my air hunger is so high because my CO2 levels are so high. They don't feel that for minutes because they simply down-regulated their response to CO2. Their CO2 is going up just like ours is going up. They don't somehow magically change that basic physiology, and they don't learn to just deal with it. They just down-regulate. Now, they also do learn to deal with it. That's how they get out at like 5 or 6 minutes. But over the first 2 or 3 minutes, they can largely eliminate that sensation of airlessness, right?
That's great. All right. So hopefully we've surprised some people here and they're intrigued to understand, well, what is true here and how can I get at some of that? So let's dive in another level of detail. Let's talk first about, and you might have already mentioned some of this, so let's go through this fairly quickly, but what are the things that the nose does for us in breathing? And by that, I mean, in grabbing a hold of and doing something with the air that it's grabbing to put into the lungs, which is a rather sensitive device. What is the nose doing for us when we use it for our breathing?
So this is the long answer, and Joe knows to cut me off because he's already figured out that I'll keep talking. But there's a number of basic functions. One of the first ones is not obvious, right? We all know about conditioning, and we could call everything else we'll talk about conditioning. But the first that's so less obvious is that by drawing air through our nose and by going through this conditioning or filtering apparatus, we actually increase the resistance to that air, right? We increase the force.
It's harder to pull the air in.
It's hard to pull the air in. And so, when you look at that on the surface, right away you go, well, that must make it harder to breathe nasally. It is harder to take a breath. You have to apply more forces. But in fact, that's a good thing, right? Here's why it's a good thing. If you've ever damaged your shoulder, you probably know when they give you rehab, they have you do this rotator cuff exercise with a band, very low resistance, because that optimizes the recruitment of the little muscles underneath that stabilize your humerus. And then later on, you start using more weight. Eventually, the bigger muscles come into play because the forces are higher and they start to recruit the big muscles. So the lung is much like that, right? When we breathe at very low resistance, we don't really need to recruit our diaphragm as much. We preferentially recruit smaller ancillary muscles in the upper chest. So we breathe from the upper chest more readily. As forces get a little higher, we start to more effectively recruit the diaphragm, right? It requires a certain amount of force that the body is essentially evolved to expect because we're supposed to breathe through our nose again. And when we don't do that, we tend to sacrifice the use of the diaphragm. That's hugely important, right? When you breathe in a shallow way with these extra muscles and don't use your diaphragm very effectively, air doesn't penetrate the lung as much. And that has to do with the ability of the gases to then diffuse without getting complicated. So right away, this thing that's a huge thing among people who are interested in fitness, what we call diaphragmic breathing, that just happens automatically by nasal breathing. You can pretty much stop teaching it, right? Teach somebody to breathe nasally and they'll breathe diaphragmically, right? Yeah. So that's a huge, important difference with lots of implications. It has implications for your ability to move generally because the diaphragm is such an important stabilizer of the total body because it's centrally located, right? So a powerful, maybe the most powerful core muscle we have. Then we get to the conditioning pieces, right? Which most of us understand on some level. When we draw the air in through our nose, the first thing we do is slow it down through a real narrowing. We call that the external valve, which is basically the opening of the nose and the small vestibule or initial cavity. And then it accelerates against these things called turbinates, right? Which are basically like rocks in a stream. They're irregularities in the structure of the nose that force it to bounce around, right? So that's a good thing, right? Because when that air is bouncing around, it can mix with all the mucus we produce in there. And that allows two things to happen. It allows that air to become humidified with water and warmed. like coming in close contact with the surfaces of the nose where the mucus is secreted. And it also allows us to capture things, what we generally call particulate matter, stuff that's in the air. Now, right away, all of us know about smoke, right? Where I am, the thing every single day, I'm in Colorado, in Colorado Springs, the thing every single day is how smoky is it, right? Especially during the summer. But now, literally, we think about that almost all year long because of forest fires all around us. So if I have smoke in the air, I don't want that going to my lung. So if I'm breathing through my nose, right, this mucus interaction allows that to be captured to a much greater degree. We also think about things like viruses and bacteria, and all of us get that now with COVID, right? I think we better understand respiratory disease transmission so much as a result of the intensive public science that's gone into COVID. And we get that, the old idea is that we're getting sick primarily from the things that we touch and put in our mouth. We recognize that that's not the main mechanism. Theoretically, that's possible, but mostly we breathe in aerosols, right? And they get caught in our mucus. And if our body is able to deal with that successfully, we don't get sick. And if it's not, right, if it overwhelms us, then we get sick. So, that's the second big thing, these pathogens, bacteria, which is not too likely in the air, but viruses in particular, which are very likely, circulating all the time. This is our basic way to work with that. So we've got the idea of conditioning the air in terms of humidity. We've got the idea of conditioning the air in terms of temperature. And we've got the idea of removing these things, particulate matters, whether they be organic things like viruses or whether they be, I can't remember now if a virus is considered technically organic. All those things are damaging to our lung potentially, right? The disease we call emphysema, it's basically you just getting too much particulate matter, typically smoke, directly smoking. Think about how you smoke, though. You inhale through your mouth, right? And it goes directly to your lung. And then you end up with this debilitating disease that no one should ever have. We call it emphysema. Lung cancer, right? Same idea. Carcinogens, which we inhale, make it to the lung and stimulate cell mutagenic change, and bam, we have cancer. We don't want any of that to happen to us. So, the Nobel Prize, and I'll struggle for his name right now, the Nobel Prize in physiology, I believe, maybe 10, 12 years ago, went to a group of scientists who had discovered the role of something called nitric oxide. And recently, one of those scientists said, you know what? And he said this publicly in a little paper, a little position paper he wrote. He said, the number one thing we could do to protect ourselves from COVID would simply be to breathe through our nose. So then you go to exercise. You're out there, ventilating at like 5, 10, 15 times normal. And you're also out there where there's cars and there's people. That's the most important time to be using this mechanism, right? To try to protect yourself. So those would be, I believe the question was, what are the big differences? What's the damage that was this the damage question or the big differences question?
No, this was just, what does breathing through the nose do for us?
Basically, I'd sum that by saying it protects us, right? And here's the sort of way I think about this. I had at least one person in my family who chose to smoke all of his life. And he and I used to argue about that all the time because I was always interested in health. And I'd say, just don't do that. And for a long, long time, he didn't experience effects of that, right? The short-term effects that he felt were positive offset any idea of that this is damaging me over time. And, over 20, 25 years of doing that, he eventually realized all those damages. And so this is the same concept, right? We may not necessarily be experiencing anything in terms of the damage created by breathing through our mouths in the short run, although sometimes you do, right? But over time, it just is nonsensical, right? It's creating this damage, and eventually that will show up. As old guys, and I don't like to call Joe that because he's a much more virile, younger guy than I am, but I am an old guy. We like it if we can get people who are younger than us, and I know that's not our primary audience here, but to realize those things that we had to learn the hard way, they don't. They have to learn it themselves the hard way, but at least we could talk about that and try to get the idea across.
It's never too late. Better to get it right for the rest of your life than to never get it right.
I will add this sibling of mine. He did eventually quit smoking, and he's still alive. I don't mind saying this. I guess there was a point where I didn't know that he would be alive, but he is. His life is much different. So it's true. It's never too late. He had smoked probably for, I'm sure, 40 years before he finally quit.
So let's dive into some more of the negative health effects of mouth breathing. Talked a little bit about damage to the lungs, and that was potentially or maybe known to be related to what used to be called exercise-induced asthma?
That's correct. So the most immediate thing, and if you're an athlete, you may already be experiencing this and not necessarily know it, or you may know it. You may be taking medication. The most immediate thing is really kind of simple, right? The alveoli, they're single cell thickness tissues, and they have surfactant, which is a liquid that allows them to maintain their shape even at very, very low pressures. And so that whole environment, it's very liquid and it's very delicate, right? So an analogy I use with my students is if I was to take some tissue paper and moisten it, what would happen if I then used a hair dryer and blew, dry, hot air on that tissue paper? It would damage it, right? So when we breathe through our mouth, we don't humidify the air that we breathe nearly as substantially. There's some moisture added as it passes down through our esophagus, but not a huge amount, not like the nasal cavity because it's not designed specifically for that. And we warm it a little bit, but not very much, right? Common scenario is the air we're breathing is colder than our body temperature. So this colder than body temperature and very dry air, it hits those delicate tissues. And, we all understand this in a very practical way. If you've ever participated in any form of athletics and you were ventilating or breathing hard, whether that's playing football just for fun out on the field, or whether you're a runner or whatever it is, and you started to cough, right? So what coughing is the only mechanism we have to clear debris or materials that get into our lung that don't have any business being there. We have to cough them out. We have really no other way to get rid of them. And so coughing is always an indication that there's something happening in the lung that shouldn't be, especially if it's sustained coughing, right? So I can remember going out on the Shootout, which is a famous ride in Tucson. A lot of pros would come out in the winter to race it, and the ride would be way faster than the rest of the year, a bike ride. And, I would end up just ventilating to like the limits, right? Because I would be struggling to hang in. And I can remember going home from that on a number of occasions where I was coughing so hard, I literally had to stop and get off my bike, and that would last for days afterward. That's damage to our lung. Essentially what coughing translates to is the idea we're damaging our lung. So over time, what we understand now is that if you keep doing that, if you keep ventilating in a way that's creating damage to your lung, ventilating orally, right, so that you're not humidifying that air, eventually your body will try to self-protect. And this is my way of trying to think about it. I like to, I'm sort of a science dork. I also like to think about the wisdom of the body. We create what's called bronchoconstriction to protect ourselves because it's the only way we can. If we're going to persist in breathing that way, the only way the body can stop you from damaging lung as much is to make it harder for you to breathe that way, to constrict your bronchi. So we call this now exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. Back about 80, when I was in Texas racing in triathlon Dallas, back about 85, I think, I was racing a lot, and I started to realize in runs that I was ventilating really fast, that I was wheezing, which is the peculiar sound you make when your bronchi constrict as you're trying to breathe heavily.
Yeah.
I started struggling. I was also having stitches at that time, which I was very well trained. I really, in theory, should have no reason to have stitches.
Yeah.
And this was a struggle. I lost some races because of that, right? Because I couldn't run as fast as I went. So I eventually went and saw this physician, and he said, "Well, you have asthma, right?" And he put me on theophylline, which is a drug of the time. They no longer use it, but because it's primarily a central nervous system stimulant, and created some anxiety and overactivation, which I was always very sensitive to. And within 2 days, I stopped taking it because I just didn't like feeling that way. Long and short of it is, I tried to address this medically, but none of the advice or inputs I got were very helpful at the time. Bronchodilators were not in the widespread use then that they are now, so I never really tried a bronchodilator. But essentially, I created this damage through breathing through my mouth. And of course, I was a triathlete and have been for a long, long time. So, and also trained hard. So, breathing very heavily through my mouth.
Well, this is very common among professional cyclists.
It is. So, it's sort of an interesting story. Many years later, when I started the national team for triathlon, I was the national team coach. One of the things I did, which was unusual, so I had a strong orientation to science. And so I worked with the sports scientists much more than other national teams did at that time. And, one of my friends, Randy Wilbur, who still is an endurance physiologist there at the training center, He was sort of charged with the idea of going out and figuring out why so many of our elite athletes could claim what's called a therapeutic use exemption for a bronchodilator, why so many of them were claiming to have asthma. And so they tested all kinds of athletes in all kinds of groups. And, they published all of that work. We see rates of between 25 and 50% of elite athletes, like literally half of elite athletes in sports like swimming and, triathlon and cycling and running will have this EIB condition, right? So we started to realize that, this is like an epidemic. In the general collegiate athlete population, which my students fall into, and maybe half of them are varsity athletes, maybe half of them are just exercise people. We test this every semester, and I see rates of around 20%. So we know that this is an extraordinarily prevalent problem in people who are ventilating. In the average, sedentary population, this hardly ever occurs, or occurrence is like less than 5%. So as we breathe more, it's clear that we do more damage. And, one of the other things we know from limited science, but any of you who ever just watch other people, say at a 10K or a bike race, know this, almost everybody breathes through their mouth. So we know that breathing more, where most people are breathing orally, it definitely associates with this idea of developing EIB. And this phenomenon is just increasing. Even though we now treat it with bronchodilators, in the short term, that can be helpful, but in the long term, that very rarely is successful, right? Most people who develop bad EIB just end up quitting, end up going out of sport.
Well, and maybe it's the medicine is overcoming the body's defense against this bad behavior that we're engaging in.
And allowing you to do it even more so. That's exactly right.
Yeah, get more damage.
Right.
Okay, so more problems then. We're trying to come up with a list of the problems that we're encountering, human beings, by mouth breathing. One of the things that I guess I always knew that through breathing practices, we can activate our nervous system and get more alert, get, even stressed feeling, get adrenaline going, cortisol. And you can also use breathing to become calm, activating your parasympathetic nervous system. But if people are mouth breathing and as a result are essentially over breathing, then they're making themselves stressed out.
So recently, and I would give kudos to James Nestor, I believe is his name, who wrote a recent bestseller about the concept of breathing I think it's called Breathe or Breath. I read that book cover to cover and sent it to every member of my family. It's a great book. Recently, many people have become aware of the idea of slow breathing normally at rest, not during exercise necessarily, but at rest. And, a whole bunch of new science has emerged. There was some science there, and a whole bunch of new science has emerged in the last 5-6 years, really clearly illustrating how powerful it is to simply breathe more slowly, to not breathe at 15 or 20 breaths per minute, which is normal, which I would always get as an average in my class because we measure that. But to breathe at more like 5 or 6 breaths per minute. And the science is pretty detailed, right? And it goes into the intricacies of how this actually helps the entire regulation of the nervous system, et cetera. So, pretty definitively, we know that there's some positive gains there and even some real easy to understand clinical stuff like your blood pressure reduces. That's a thing that most of us could easily understand. So then an interesting question is, if that's true at rest, if most of us are breathing too fast in a way that isn't really helpful to us, it's actually detrimental. We should learn to breathe more slowly. Could that be the case during exercise? So my colleagues in the field of exercise, they sometimes want to separate and think of exercise as something completely different than rest. What I've mostly, even though I was exposed to that way of thinking early, I've mostly come to realize that it's really not different. It's just the same thing happening at a higher rate, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of a slower nasal breathing approach, if it's helpful to us at rest to allow us to relax, to reduce some sympathetic activation, to increase parasympathetic activation, something we now in science can easily study with what's called heart rate variability. Maybe this happens during exercise. So no one has really studied that yet. I have a current study going, which won't get done for years because of the way that I'm doing it, where I am trying to look at that. But no one else has really studied that yet. Does the same thing happen during exercise? But here's the athlete side of me and the coach side of me. I've had the opportunity as an athlete and coach, first of all, to be pretty successful, NCAA level and senior national American level water polo. I was pretty good at it. And to be around people who also are very good at it, who are also very successful coaches. As national team coach, to be around lots of people. if you were to ask me whether coaches at the elite level consider that working hard is more important than working relaxed, literally all of them would say the athletes who succeed are the ones who relax into the work, not the ones who work the hardest.
That's interesting.
Right? In other words, trying too hard isn't helpful. What's helpful is learning to do hard work and relax yourself as much as possible while you do it. And you literally, once you've watched athletes for many, many decades, you can see this in an athlete, that they simply move more easily.
Yeah.
And there's, some neuromuscular stuff I could talk about to help explain this, but if the idea that nasal breathing helps us to be more relaxed in our activity is occurring at rest, why might it not be the case during exercise? We don't know yet, right? We just don't have the science. But, for me, certainly that's an avenue that we need to look at that. Is this actually helping us? Now, on a personal, experiential level, and Joe could comment too because he's been doing this, I can absolutely tell you that I feel more relaxed, right? Once I adapted to nasal breathing, one of the things that changed for me is just feeling more relaxed than what I was doing. Not only when I was, say, running or cycling, but in my life.
Awesome. Well, I'm hoping to get there myself. I would say at the moment it's stressful as I'm trying to adapt. But I did want to get back to this idea that if we can breathe.
Do you mind if I comment on that really quickly?
No, please go ahead.
So here's a conundrum, right? A problem. I'm doing a study right now where it's my regular students. None of them are adapted to nasal breathing. They do a really low level of exercise. We see sort of two patterns of response. This work's not done yet, not published. It'll probably be years before it's published, but because we're doing it like semester to semester. But here's this thing. Some of the students, even at a very light level of work, and very typical would be about 100 watts on a bike. Joe could relate to that, right? Beginning warm up even for a low level rider. When they're cycling about 100 watts, some of them will already be feeling some air hunger when they breathe nasally. We're basically comparing nasal breathing to oral breathing. When they breathe nasally, they'll feel some air hunger. And they experience some anxiety as a result of that, because there's nothing more powerful to create anxiety or fear in a human being than the stimulus that says you're not breathing enough.
Oh, yeah. Suffocating. Horrible.
Yeah, it's the most primitive instinct and reflexive response we have. So in their case, everything deranges, right? They ventilate more, breathing nasally. Their lactate levels are higher, indicating that they're not getting enough air, enough oxygen, and they're actually forced on anaerobic metabolism. Some of the students can do that light level of work, breathing nasally, not feel that air hunger, and they have all the classic responses that we see in people who are adapted, which, of course, we've studied and published that work as well. Their ventilation is a little lower. They're using a little less oxygen. They're more economic. I don't have good data yet on HRV because it's pretty variable, but my suggestion is probably that their HRVs are a little higher, indicating a little more parasympathetic level. All the stuff seems to go in the right way to a great degree as a function of the first level at which you try to do this. Did it go past where you're ready for it, where you feel air hunger? Or is it at a level like when you say go for a walk after dinner where you can breathe through your nose, not even think about it, and feel fine? So the trick oftentimes is to find your way to just the threshold point where your body can do this nasal breathing. You might have some suggestion of air hunger and then start working there.
Yeah. Right.
And if you go further, it turns the whole experience into something horrible, right? I mean, literally, you feel like you're suffocating. Yeah. Again, I want to reinforce that by starting there, you adapt. You adapt in two primary ways, and those sensations change. And before you know it, you can do more and more work. And as I've illustrated myself, both in a case study and a group study, at some point, you can then do as much work breathing nasally as you can orally and not feel necessarily any of that air hunger beyond what you would feel trying to do max work orally.
Well, that's great. And we're going to actually finish this up by going through this process of how do you become adapted to do this. But before we hit that, I wanted to hit on this issue of some of the negative effects of mouth breathing and advantages of nasal breathing. We probably don't even need to convince people anymore. I mean, it's been amazing how much the evidence is in the favor of nasal breathing, but still, I think that it's worth hitting on some more of these points that we haven't hit yet. You had said that if we could just slow our breathing, we could calm ourselves, we could have a more parasympathetic, relaxed approach, and we talked about how that could even be advantageous from an athletic performance point of view. But the question is, well, how the heck can you breathe slower when you're exercising hard? Well, the answer is nasal breathing allows you to get more oxygen per breath. So you need fewer breaths. Is that right?
That's correct. So, in all the projects that have directly compared nasal to oral breathing, most of which are done in people who are not adapted to nasal breathing, my project was done in people who were adapted to it. We see this idea of ventilatory efficiency, right? What that means is that we measure how much you ventilate, how much air you breathe, right? We typically refer to that as per minute, liters per minute. And we measure something called VO2, or the amount of oxygen you consume. And in every one of those studies, what we see is that when you're breathing nasally, you ventilate less for the amount of oxygen you consume. We literally calculate a ratio called the ventilatory equivalent, which just takes the ventilation, divides it by the VO2. And when the number is bigger, what it means as a ratio is that you're breathing more to get the same oxygenation, right? So, one of the principal advantages of nasal breathing is it's more efficient. It allows us to extract the same amount of oxygen, but do less breathing to do so. And we could get into a discussion of why, but a lot of that's theoretical and it's pretty involved. But we absolutely know that happens, right?
Yeah. Well, even just your own experience is that you can perform at the same level. In fact, you've even said PRs. So even at a higher level, breathing through your nose, which by definition means you're breathing less.
That's exactly right. I'm actually, if I measure it, I'm actually breathing less. Say I'm running at a pace of 7 minutes per mile, right? I'm actually ventilating literally a quarter less. So that means that, remember we talked earlier on about the idea that about 15% of our energy running hard like that would go to breathing only. So now I'm reducing that by a quarter, right? I'm reducing that 15% where now it's more like 12% of my energy is going to that. And in our study, we've been able to demonstrate that resulted in a net economy gain, meaning the overall production of energy when you're running, breathing nasally is actually reduced in a meaningful way. So, when I was national team coach, I remember one of the interns at one point brought me this study about weight training and how it improved economy and performance in runners, it was the first study to really show us that. And that was an open question back in those days in the 90s. Should runners particularly weight train? And so, that opened my eyes to this idea. And of course, now all elite runners and all elite triathletes all do extensive weight training to try to get that little economy improvement because they can perform better. Well, we're talking about creating something very comparable simply by adapting to a different approach to breathing where you don't have to breathe as much, so you don't have to use as much energy for breathing to produce the same external work outcome, the same pace of running or power output in your bicycle, et cetera. So, that's a potential performance improvement. We have no study that's directly looked at performance yet on this. In fact, there's only about 5 or 6 studies really looking at this in any legitimate experimental design. And like 20 total studies overall, even looking at nasal breathing out of the hundreds of thousands of exercise physiology studies we have, maybe even more than that now. So there's limited science looking at this, which doesn't mean it's not occurring. It means just, it's not occurred to anybody to look at it. So absolutely, we can reduce the total amount we have to ventilate because it's so much more efficient to breathe nasally, and that might let us perform better.
Yeah. And why should that be such a shock? If this is the way we're designed to breathe, why shouldn't it be more efficient than some way that we're not designed to breathe?
So Joe and I haven't talked about this, but I actually opened the book I'm writing right now with something that's sort of extraordinary and, really can't be denied. If you're familiar with David Rudisha, 800-meter world record holder, progression of like 4 settings of the world record, eventually that culminated in, I believe it was 2016 in Rio, I think, is when he set the final record. That's considered one of the greatest, like Bob Beeman-esque kinds of outcomes in track and field because, he literally ran right to the front. It's like he was in a time trial. Everybody just lined up behind him. And then he eventually just ran away from them, meaning that they were all able to draft him, yet he still was able to run away. It was like he didn't even consider that the other elite athletes, this is the Olympic final, were even in the race, right? So if you look at the video of that on Let's Run, which if you're a runner, you might know about, is kind of a discussion vehicle on the net and, attracts a lot of competitive runners. They're talking about this and they basically say, yeah, that guy's amazing. Does he do drugs? What they always talk about. But then one commenter said, he could run even faster. He doesn't know how to breathe right. He was breathing only through his nose. So I look back at the video and it's so obvious. He has his mouth completely closed the whole time.
Wow.
So why would an elite athlete of African descent, he's Kenyan, I believe, a Maasai warrior, actually, from that tribe, why might he have adopted that? Well, maybe that's something that was part of their culture, right? For whatever reason, I also had read in at least one interview with his coach at the time that he had emphasized nasal breathing. He had adopted that. So here's a guy achieving the highest work output of any human being in history over a period of time that requires an extreme amount of ventilation and a large aerobic component. And he's doing it breathing nasally. Yeah. So, if he can do that level of work, can the rest of us running at 8 or 9 or 10 minute miles breathe? Now, of course we can. Yeah. We just have to adapt to it.
And so we're going to get next into how to adapt to it, because I think this is really the question. This is the question that I have. I'm convinced I want to do it. I just need to know how. But I did want to point out, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there are benefits to be had here by breathing properly beyond just performing better as an athlete. There's health benefits that we've been talking about, but some of this is just fundamental stuff like improving your sleep, recovering from exercise, just lowering your chronic stress level. All of these things you would get by nasal breathing, all of which could be independent or just buttress up your athletic endeavors, but just to have a better life. If you can get these advantages, even if it turns out that it's not worth it to you for whatever reason to do these adaptations, doing the nasal breathing just for everything else in your life, you're going to get big benefits out of it. So you don't have to think of this as an all or nothing thing, that I'm going to do this, but if I don't manage to be able to run 4-minute miles nasal breathing, then it'll all have been a waste. No, every step along the way is a benefit to your health. Am I right about this?
So I'd restate that sort of general thought, general axiom. We should try to breathe through our nose whenever we can. And to the degree that we do that, it's better for us. And, all of us are humans. We all recognize that we might say, okay, I can't do that in this situation. I can't run a race or do this particular workout, et cetera. That's always an individual choice. But to the degree that you can increase and do as much nasal breathing as possible, that's beneficial to you. As Joe alluded to, we have some clear-cut emerging science now on sleep, showing us that this will help us with sleep. There's not a huge amount of prior science on that, but there's some that's emerging. We have this clear-cut idea of prevention of disease. This hasn't been studied in a classic experimental model because you can't easily control people's breathing patterns in a clinical experimental model. Like for the next 6 weeks, I want you to only breathe through your nose. We have no way to regulate or easily control that. But we have these comparison studies of people who have what's called dysfunctional breathing, which mostly relates to breathing through the mouth a lot, lots of other elements of it, but where we see better health outcomes, et cetera, in cross-sectional comparisons. So that evidence suggests this is probably a good idea. And then we have this anecdotal experience like my own or Joe's of, adapting to this and reducing the frequency of infections. So all of that's a pretty good bet. And really, from my perspective as a scientist, one of those things I want to emphasize to other scientists to open your eyes to this and start studying it, right? That in my field, in exercise physiology, this has been excluded from the beginning. We never even considered this. And I'm hoping now that we start to realize we need to study this, right? We may have gone completely down the wrong path by just assuming that you had to breathe through your mouth when you were exercising.
Fantastic.
So there's benefits potentially, and this is all in potential, again, just because no one has studied it directly, in terms of what people who try to maintain athleticism for a long time know becomes the primary limitation, and that's your functional ability to move. Right? When we engage the diaphragm more successfully, which we do pretty much automatically by nasal breathing, that probably relates back to our ability to move more successfully. The only science on that shows that there's a relationship between your functional movement ability and whether you're a dysfunctional or a functional nasal breather, right? Showing that people who are functional nasal breathers have better functional movement ability. We have no direct experimentation. But having done this now for 15 years, one of my principal problems, because I'm a professor sitting at a desk doing what we're doing now, or standing in front of a class with all the bad posture elements. Plus, I ride a bike for 10, 12 hours a week. Again, the worst possible thing you could do for your posture is that the nasal breathing in conjunction with functional work has really helped me to regain better movement ability and postural stuff and overcome some long-standing kinds of musculoskeletal problems I've had. So I won't say that I won't try to say that just nasal breathe and that all goes away. It's not like that. But by activating the diaphragm more successfully, that helps in the process of retraining your body to move in a more functional way, in a posturally more efficient kind of manner. So the two things interrelate to each other, absolutely.
Great.
There's a sort of an idea, which might be the most important idea, but I have to talk about it theoretically because we really have never studied it. Joe, do you want me to delve into the whole coronary blood flow concept?
I guess we have a duty to mention it, but
okay.
Let's try to keep it as short as we can because we really are already over time.
Okay, let me just summarize by saying we've long known that hyperventilation causes coronary vessel constriction, right? And people die on occasion who are have susceptible blood flow issues in the heart. When we breathe nasally during exercise, we probably are ventilating normally. We definitely reduce our ventilation. We're really hyperventilating when we breathe orally. It's not a big stretch to imagine, without going into the mechanisms, that oral breathing might be the reason we see damage to the hearts of endurance athletes that we didn't really expect to see. It's really started getting studied about 10 years ago. It translates into a little higher rate of atrial fibrillation, a particular arrhythmia that seems to be a focus in endurance athletes. And, I'm operating or offering an operational theory that this may not just be about exercising too much and too intensely. It may have more to do with exercising breathing through your mouth and creating conditions that might favor ischemia a little bit more in the heart at the same time. The basics of that are CO2 is a vasodilator. So when you drop CO2 levels lower or don't elevate them as much because you're breathing orally, you may also then, that may result in a bit of constriction in the coronary blood vessels, which is the main way that you create some damage to your heart through ischemia, through a lack of blood flow or lack of oxygen. So that's not been studied at all. And I'm out there by myself, right, talking about this right now.
Okay.
So, I'm essentially postulating a theory that I'm hoping someone will, I'm getting ready to retire. I'm hoping somebody will, take that up and start to look at that idea.
Okay, great. So let's move into this question of, how to do this. And I think that we ought to, again, start at the top here. It's going to take some time to learn to adapt to nasal breathing. What's your experience been? How long does it take?
I'll typically say between 6 weeks and 6 months. And here's the big variable. Well, there's two big variables. The first big variable, some people already are pretty low on sensitivity. Like one of the athletes he listened to me talk one time in Pueblo and then came afterwards and talked about wanting to do this. He was a black belt in karate, a very good local runner in Pueblo. Yeah. And, in karate, if you spar, you wear a mouthpiece and you get used to doing 3-minute, sparring sessions, sort of like short intervals. And you're already pretty adapted to nasal breathing, right? Because you have to breathe nasally. Football players, same thing happens with them, boxers. He, within 6 weeks, was running a PR for like the last decade, I believe, in the half marathon, breathing nasally. He thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened to him. But he was already probably well adapted, probably had a pretty low chemosensitivity because of that other practice, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you get somebody like me who as I look back at my history now, I understand that I was pretty much dominantly a mouth breather. I probably had very high chemosensitivity. I always had some reasonably high anxiety around, particularly, people and, being in public segments. And, it took me a much longer time. I literally spent most of a year to get to the point where I was fully adapted. But then the second piece that was important is I only did a little bit of this at first. I only did what I could do in my warm-up. And, it took me like a couple months before I was even doing like aerobic threshold, the general speed at which you might do a lot of your training work. But then it started accelerating. Once I got there, I started realizing, what, I'm adapting to this. Then it accelerated. And about a year after I started is when I ran those PRs.
Okay.
So that time course, it has to do with how chemosensitive you are probably in the first place, how well developed your diaphragm is in the first place. Were you really dysfunctional in your breathing? And it also has to do with how diligently do you want to apply this? Are you going to be impatient as I was and, still unwilling to give away your harder training? Or are you going to be willing to slow down enough so you can do all of your training nasally and then gradually add the intensity?
I got you. All right.
I want to emphasize that point. We're not saying that you have to slow down permanently. We're saying that you have to slow down temporarily to allow yourself to adapt successfully. You're going to, assuming you have no, anatomical limitations, you're going to reach the same or maybe even greater ability level. You just have to do that as a process, just like how we train in the first place. It's really no different than the idea that somebody says, I'm going to start to run, so eventually I can run a 10K. That doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. But this business of people have to slow down is only true if they want to adapt as fast as possible. If they want to just keep going and mouth breathe at their highest levels of output, then it's going to slow down their adaptation, but they could do nasal breathing at lower levels of output. Is that right?
That's absolutely true. And, there would be some who take the position that, well, this is something I can only do for this kind of training, and that's all I ever want to do. That's a choice, right? Then I keep coming back to that axiom, recognize that the rest of the time you're doing some damage to yourself, to your physiology.
Right.
But, might choose to accept that, right? That's your choice.
Right.
Any level at which you do this is probably beneficial. And we do have some studies, including some elements of the studies that I've done, that suggest strongly that even if you just use nasal breathing as part of your training process, some of the changes in how you ventilate, for instance, ventilating more slowly, more diaphragmically, will start to feed back to conditions where you use your mouth. There's one really interesting study that just came out this year that sort of suggests that very strongly.
I see. So this would be the case where the guy is nasal breathing in training, but mouth breathing in races?
Yes, somebody like that. Somebody might choose to do that, or they might say, I'm only going to nasal breathe for what, quote, aerobic training. I mean, again, they're all choices. I do want to emphasize you can nasal breathe to do everything. You just have to adapt to doing that.
Yeah.
But, you also, in the process, any combination of that is better than not ever nasal breathing. But one of the things I would suggest is that we've kind of learned oral breathing even when it's not really necessary. Several studies show us that virtually any healthy young person can breathe up to their aerobic threshold and even up to about 80% of VO2 max, breathing nasally just by choosing to do that. But most of us will open our mouth as soon as we say, go out for a run. We might not have to, but we just do it, right? It's like we associate it with that activity, so it's just a learned behavior.
Yeah, it's a habit. Okay, so I wanted to summarize the parts of the adaptation, and then I wanted you to then go through, what was this process that you recommended? But I ended up with 3 things, maybe 3.5 things here. The first one is you've got to reduce your sensitivity to CO2. And the reason that you have a high sensitivity to it, if you're a mouth breather, is that you've been mouth breathing. And so your CO2 levels have been artificially lowered by that. And so that's what your body is used to. And it doesn't like it when it goes above that. But it's fine to be above that. You just have to get your body used to that.
That's exactly right. I hesitate with used to. It goes away. Right? I always want to emphasize this point. You don't have to deal with this or tolerate it or get used to it. It just goes away. You just have to expose yourself enough to it, and it goes away.
Great. Okay. The second thing then is, if you haven't been using your nasal passages properly, then they are not in good shape. And you're going to have to get control over them. And there are things you can do mechanically, and then there are practices you can use to learn how to condition your nasal passages and learn how to open them so that you can breathe properly. I don't know if you want to mention a couple of those here, and then we can move on to the last thing.
Sure. There's some muscular adaptation that's likely to have to occur, particularly at the higher levels of work where you've never breathed nasally before. One of those is in the nares, the flare of your nose. You actually have small muscles that allow your nose to flare when you want to breathe at higher volume. One of the things I remember experiencing is that I would get fatigue. I associated this with dehydration, and my nasal passage would almost like collapse, right? After some period of time. Eventually that went away because it's still a muscular response, right? You're actually training those little bit of muscles.
Oh, that's funny.
What I found was that if I used an external dilator, right, a strip,
Yeah.
right? That prevented that from happening.
Oh,
And then over time, I didn't really need to use one of those at all.
that's interesting.
There's a whole complicated idea about how these various internal dilators can assist us, all the way to the point where there's some forms of internal dilators, which are really medical devices, that stent both the external valve, the one we're used to, where like there's either tape on the outside or something internal that's like a little
Right.
ring. They're actually dilators that stent that valve as well as the deeper internal valve. Essentially, they're like a net that goes in and expands and opens up the airway all the way back into the esophagus, pretty much. And, using that sort of device, there's at least one study that shows that you could literally perform the same work immediately breathing nasally with that kind of stent that you could perform breathing orally. So there's some continuum of that, how you'd want to use that, right? Depending on how comfortable you were.
Okay.
And a whole discussion about when and when not
Right.
to. The second piece is the diaphragm itself, right? Once we're highly trained, particularly breathing orally, and we do have a sort of a chest-dominated approach to breathing, we really don't use our diaphragm adequately. As soon as we breathe nasally, it's sort of like putting yourself into a bigger gear on a bicycle. You'll adapt to it. You just have to start doing it and recognize at first, you won't be able to turn that gear for long,
Sure.
right? And then over time, you'll get stronger. That muscle will get stronger and more conditioned to the way that you're breathing now at a kind of a lower frequency, but with more force. And that adaptation is probably the slowest part of how somebody adapts to nasal breathing, because it's just like getting stronger in weight training. There's some amount of time that it takes. It's not a thing that happens really quickly.
Yeah.
Sensitization to CO2 levels, that changes fairly quickly, and you just have to keep stepping it up to higher and higher levels.
Right.
The diaphragmic activation is, again, sort of like getting stronger through interval training to run or in the weight room. It's just a slightly slower process.
Yeah.
But it still happens, right? If you recognize that that's what's going on and you proceed slowly, 3 months, it's not unreasonable that most people could get where they could literally do almost all their work in 3 months. Certainly by 6 months. It took me a year because I didn't know what I was doing. I was making it up as I went.
And you didn't know what was possible either, so
No.
you weren't pushing it.
No, it's totally experimenting.
You also mentioned that you recommend using a neti pot or something like that.
So one of the things that, when I sort of had this open out-of-the-box experience that I thought about was that, okay, if I'm going to start moving all this air through my nose, right, and I'm going to hit all these conditioning apparatus or elements of the nose, there's a potential for overwhelming that, just like we overwhelm the lung when we try to breathe through our mouth. And so, one of the ways that we can overwhelm that is through the idea that initially, you may experience this as a allergic response kind of stimulus. Your body's not used to you breathing a lot through your nose. So, you produce a lot of mucus in response to that. And I can absolutely remember the first months of doing this. I was producing so much mucus that when I ran inside on a treadmill, I literally had to make sure I had something there so that I wouldn't offend the people around me, because I was constantly having to blow my nose. Over time, that diminished. And, now literally I never produce anything. I never carry anything with me, never really produce excess mucus where I have to blow my nose when I'm out running, et cetera. But so that idea tells us that, we can overwhelm this conditioning system too. And so the basic thread is that we'll produce a lot more mucus, accumulate more mucus in our sinuses. And of course, when we do that, that means whatever particulate matter, pathogens, et cetera, they're in your sinuses. This is really where sinus infections come from. So, right away, I also started using a neti pot every day. Like brushing your teeth, not using a neti pot the way they're typically studied and used once you get sick, just using it every day to keep my nasal passage clearing. Now, I would really emphasize this. I just convinced my oldest brother maybe 6 months ago to use a neti pot. And here's the most important thing I said to him. This is going to be horrible at first, right? The first time you go to use a neti pot, you've got all this material in your sinuses. You have no realization of that. That water can barely go through, right? And so you're going to be choking. It's going to go down your throat, and you just have to persist. Over a day or two, you'll start to get water to go through there, and within about 2 weeks, you'll largely clear that out if you use it every day, even like once every day. And then before you know it, it's 10 seconds, just drains through, go to the other nostril, 10 seconds. The whole thing maybe takes you a minute or two, right? So that does two things. It helps you to continually clear out that excess mucus you're going to be creating because you are breathing, you're exposing your nose to a lot more stimuli than it usually gets. And it also helps you to keep that nasal passage moist, right? So that like I typically use my neti pot before I go to train in the morning so that my nose is moist and I can feel that I'm breathing easily through my nose, right? I favor that quite a bit. So you don't have to use it excessively. Pretty much I do this once a day. It takes me about a minute. There's the water prep, and that's another discussion. But and result of that, combined with the idea that I now try to breathe through my nose literally all the time, just seem to never get sick.
Well, and I'll tell you, my experience is that it is a terrible thing when you first start doing it the first few times, but after a while, it's a wonderful thing. You just feel clean. I mean, it's like brushing your teeth. You don't want to not do it after you're used to doing it. Okay, so we really are really running out of time here. So let's try to give us the real short version of what's the mindset to have? How hard should I be trying to exercise while I'm nasal breathing so that I don't, give myself a psychological problem or give up?
Here's my suggestion. In the modern era, most of us who exercise at least on occasion, go inside. Get on a treadmill if you're a walker, runner, or you get on a bike, a stationary bike. My suggestion is to try this initially. Get on whatever indoor device you have. If you have a heart rate monitor, great. And then go at the slowest speed you can get yourself, way slower than you used to going, and breathe nasally. And then every 3 minutes or so, just increase that a little bit. Like on a treadmill, if I start at 1 mile per hour, maybe I'll go to 1.5, then to 2.5. Or if I'm a runner, maybe I start at like 4 or 5 miles per hour, increase it a half mile per hour. And keep registering in your brain, or even write it down. That's always better. Just how much air hunger you feel. We use this little scale. 7, it's like being held underwater, you're going to drown. 1, just normal, like we are right now. Even though, and you can be running and still at 1, right? You're getting the amount of air that is normal for that condition. And that will help you to figure out where you start to experience air hunger. And then what I would suggest is that you go just a little below that, right? Just at that threshold, and slow everything down to that threshold and train that way, and come back to that sort of way of assessing yourself every week or two. And you'll start to see that you can go a little further. And then that translates back into, what we call your prescription. Now go a little faster breathing nasally. And by regularly monitoring how far you're going, eventually you'll start going to work that's pretty hard, right? And eventually, if you do it long enough and keep this process going, you'll start to reach your maximum, right? You'll go as fast as you can actually go. What we call, as physiologists, we call that a graded exercise test. So the other piece about that is, that's actually a very good way to warm up anyway. One of the big mistakes people make in exercise is that they start too fast. We all benefit. Like the Kenyans, they start out running 12-minute miles. These are guys who can run 4:30s, 5-minute miles, comfortably, right? They're running marathon paces beyond that. But they start running at ridiculously slow paces. And that's what all really well-versed runners or cyclists do. We start very, very slow. So, this is also a good practice in teaching yourself a better way to warm up. You just start very slow and gradually increasing in stages. And it gives you a way to start to see how fast you can really go, where you might have just a minimum sensation of some air hunger, but not anything that's going to make it where that exercise becomes onerous, right? And again, that will go away. And as it goes away, you'll be able to go a little faster over weeks to months.
That's terrific. Is there anything like a metric that people could use? I mean, is it HRV? Is it using some sort of a monitor for how many breaths they're taking a minute? Like, because I know like Whoop straps and Oura rings track actually using your heart rate. They track what your respiration rate is. Do you recommend anything so people can just tell whether they're getting better or not?
Well, I would mostly, again, focus on the ability to simply use that breathing route. There are respiratory rate monitors now. That's actually an emerging concept. People using that as a way to sort of guide exercise intensity versus, say, heart rate or lactates or things like that. But they're not common yet, and I personally have never seen one. Right? That an easy to use monitor that measures respiratory rate. We measure it using the same metabolic cards we measure the other stuff with. So again, I would focus back on this simple idea. If you put a little water in your mouth so that you don't have to think about nasal breathing, And then your main metric that determines success is, I can do this. Now I can do it a little faster, right? That's all to the good. If you're a person who likes to measure heart rate, one of the things a lot of people experience, and I experienced this at first, was all of a sudden your heart rates will be lower. Now, that seems to stabilize over time, and in our study with adapted breathers, it actually proves basically the same heart rates nasally as orally at the same work levels, but that's a common observational thing, and a thing I've heard many, people who have done this for a while say that they remember experiencing, and I definitely did, right? One of the things that was astounding to me when I started to do this, for me to get my heart rate under 150 and be running was literally impossible, and all of a sudden I was getting heart rates in the 130s. That changes over time, but in general, in my experience, my heart rates have never gone back to where they used to be when I ran. Yeah, even running as fast as I would have run at those times. So the heart rate thing is interesting, but the main metric is simply that you can do it and that you start being able to do it faster, at faster paces or higher power outputs, et cetera. A lot of times people think of the end game being to reduce your respiratory rate as much as possible. I don't really see it that way. I see that as a natural outcome of nasal breathing, not the objective itself, right? The objective is simply to be able to do it. The outcome is that you'll end up breathing slower and you'll end up ventilating less.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I would look at it. There's an awful lot of stuff out there now about various strategies, et cetera. To me, this is a relatively simple concept. We're just better off breathing nasally. We need to figure out the level at which we can do that and not make it unduly uncomfortable, and then gradually increase that over time as it becomes possible for us to do that. Really the way that we should all exercise, if we're not immediately competing, et cetera.
So we're just gradually increasing it until we can do anything nasal breathing.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. George, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Joe.
Is there some way you would like people to find you or reach out to you? Do you have a website or something like that?
If you're interested in the science on this, my last name is Dallam, which is an old English name and very uncommon. So if you combine that with my first name, you'll find your way to the science in Google Scholar pretty easily, or just Dallam and nasal. So we've done a case study, a group study. A colleague and I wrote a review paper on the topic. Really, there's only about 20 experimental studies on this. And right now, I'm on sabbatical, so right now I'm writing a book on this. And likely that'll publish somewhere, hopefully later in the spring, right? I'm hoping to get into the spring semester with the basic draft written and then, work to publish it. And so I would just do that, right? I would, if you're interested in these ideas, in particular the group study, which has been reported a lot in the media, it's the important one because it's shown us that it's possible to adapt to this. No one else had ever even looked at that concept. Basically the science just showed us that we could do some level of nasal breathing and showed us that we absolutely couldn't do a maximum level. But what we've illustrated is the idea that, you can actually adapt to doing this where you don't have to give away any work capacity. We also demonstrated, that in a person who had existing EIB, that they were able to rectify that with, essentially make it go away when they were breathing nasally and achieve the same kind of max.
And that was your personal experience, right?
That was my personal experience. Yes, that's true.
Well, that's fantastic. All right, George. Well, thanks again, man. This has been so educational. You have a great day.
Okay, you too, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening in to my discussion with George Dallam about the science and benefits of nasal breathing. I hope you found it as important as I did. I have started on my switch over to 100% nasal breathing, and the results are very good already. I also wanted to let you know that I will be providing at least one shortened version of this talk that focuses on the how to adapt to nasal breathing portion for your friends who just can't sit still for a long podcast. The show notes are full of the details and tips provided by Dr. Dallam. You can find them on wiseathletes.com, wiseathletes.com. And while you're there, you can sign up to take a free fitness practices assessment, send us a question to address on the podcast, see all of our episodes, subscribe to our podcast, and you can sign up for our newsletter. If you're on social media and enjoyed this episode, please post about it. That'd be a great help. Thanks again.